Welcome to the Florida Historical Society Virtual Annual Meeting and Symposium. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, and our theme for this year's conference is 2020 Hindsight, How Florida's Past Informs the Present and Future. We're at the headquarters of the Florida Historical Society at the Library of Florida History in Cocoa. Our first annual meeting was held in 1856 in St. Augustine. Since then, we've held our conference all over the state, from Key West to Pensacola, Tampa to Daytona, and many points in between. COVID-19 forced us to cancel our plans to gather together last May, so we're presenting a virtual conference for the first time. We hope you enjoy it. In addition to our annual awards presentation and the membership meeting, this conference will feature fascinating panel discussions. Some of the state's leading historians and some impressive history students will be engaged in enlightening conversations about Florida history and culture. The conference will culminate with a keynote presentation by noted historian and legal scholar Martha S. Jones. When the 1920 Florida Historical Society annual meeting was held a century ago in Jacksonville, that city was still feeling the impact of an influenza pandemic that had taken place 2 years earlier. There were strong racial divisions in Florida as the Ku Klux Klan marched through the streets of downtown Orlando, and extreme violence erupted in Ocoee to suppress the African American right to vote. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed that same year, officially giving women the right to vote. 100 years later, in 2020, our focus is remarkably similar. Today, our panel discussion is called Going Viral: Pandemics in Florida. Tomorrow's session is called Civil Rights, Equality, and Racial Justice in the Age of Black Lives Matter. And on day 3, the conversation is called 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, Florida Women Breaking Barriers. This promises to be a fascinating conference. Here to welcome you to the Florida Historical Society Virtual Annual Meeting and Symposium is our president, Emily Liska.
Hello all, and thank you, Ben, and welcome. And Ben, thanks for an excellent overview. And I want to thank you again and the outstanding staff at the Florida Historical Society for your creativity and your tireless effort to present a fall annual meeting. Prior to the many changes brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, in early February, the Society's board of directors and Ben agreed that an annual meeting in October in the fall would better serve the membership, yet the Society could retain the tradition of a spring conference. And the talented staff and the tireless staff moved forward to lay the groundwork for this fall conference. Therefore, it's with great pride I welcome you to the first all-virtual annual meeting of the Florida Historical Society. The Society embraces the opportunity to capture and share significant Florida history, and during this conference, reflect on history relating to the unique time we're all experiencing. We offer outstanding academics who will provide fresh research and insights. Special appreciation is in order for the University of Central Florida and Dr. Connie Lester, as we include the university's 8th annual Gerald Schaffner Lecture Series on Florida History and Culture. And it will feature legal speaker and author Martha S. Jones. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the Florida Historical Society, thank you for joining us. You are part of this important team. We are keenly aware of your participation and your contributions to Florida history. You truly make a difference. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks, Emily. We're presenting this conference free of charge. If you enjoy what you see and would like continued access to similar programs, please consider becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Just go to myfloridahistory.org or call 321-690-1971, extension 217, to become a member. Our first panel discussion is called Going Viral: Pandemics in Florida. It features 3 prominent Florida historians, authors, and educators: Gary Mormino from the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, Stephen Knoll from the University of Florida in Gainesville, and Connie Lester from the University of Central Florida. Also on the panel is Andrew Kashuni, an honors undergraduate thesis student at UCF. Let's get started with our first panel, Going Viral, Pandemics in Florida.
My name is Connie Lester. I'm an associate professor at the University of Central Florida in the History Department, and I'm the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. And I will be the moderator today for our panel discussion, and I would like to introduce you first the members of the panel. Gary Mormino is probably known to everyone who's looking at this video, but he is the Frank E. Duckwall Professor Emeritus and past Director of the Florida Studies Program at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. He is the author of Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Modern Florida, which was published in 2005. Immigrants on the Hill, which was published in 1986, and The Immigrant World of Ybor City, which was published in 1987. That book won the Theodore Salutis Prize for the outstanding book in ethnic immigration history. And he is the recipient of the Florida Lifetime Achievement Award for Writing in 2014 and the Dorothy Dodd Lifetime Achievement Award from the Florida Historical Society in 2012. Dr. Steve Knoll teaches in the History Department at the University of Florida, where he has taught since 1992. He received his PhD from UF in 1991. He has published 3 books, Feeble-Minded in Our Midst in 1995, Mental Retardation in America in 2004, and most recently, Ditch of Dreams, The Cross-Florida Barge Canal and the Struggle for Florida Future in 2009. Knoll is currently working on 2 books, one on the continuing controversy over removing Rodman Dam from the Ocklawaha River, and the other on the disability rights protests of the 1970s. Our third panelist is Andrew Kashuni, and he is a graduating senior at the University of Central Florida. He has honors in the major thesis titled Pestilence and Poverty, the Great Influenza Pandemic and Underdevelopment in the New South, 1918 to 1919, was defended in April 2020. He presented a paper on his work at the Florida Conference of Historians in February 2020. His work includes a digital component, an interactive website titled Mapping Flu Mortality in Florida, 1918 to 1919. For those of you who say, I want to know more about this young man, UCF already has him for his master's degree. So I'm happy to be moderating this panel, and I will give you some general information about how this will operate. So the scope of the pandemic is something that most of us hadn't thought much about until recently. And so it may be unfamiliar to you. So the first part of the discussion will be one in which I will pose questions to the panelists about the pandemic itself and how it played out in Florida. And the second part, I will pose questions about how we interpret this going forward as historians, and particularly in light of what we now know. So if there are no questions from the panelists about what we're going to do, then I'll pose the first question. Many in our audience are already familiar with your work. But please take a moment to give us the elevator speech outlining your work on health, epidemics, and pandemics in Florida. In answering this question, help our audience get a general sense of the health of Floridians in the period 1800 to 1920. And then I may have some follow-up questions. So we'll start with Dr. Mormino.
Certainly. Well, I consider myself a social historian, not really a historian of health. Honestly, I hadn't really given that much thought about the history of health until recently. And what I find fascinating about the flu pandemic is if you went to a history textbook before 1960, I don't believe it's even mentioned. Uh, it's one of the great mysteries, kind of the profession, how little had been done about it. One argument about that is that we utterly failed, and as a can-do nation, the embarrassment. The best example here is Alfred Crosby. Has influenced this panel as much as anyone. And when he wrote his book, one of the first books about the flu in 1979, I think it was, he said he was shocked at how little secondary sources had ever been dedicated to that. So as a historian of modern Florida, I'm very interested in World War I. The flu was kind of irresistible to me. And in fact, I should add, I'm finishing a book now on Florida, 1513, 2020, and we're here to finish it on with the great pandemic we're dealing with now. Looking back at it, how paradise and pandemics, what an interesting combination in a state like Florida, where we're seemingly immune from life's afflictions, but not really.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Noel?
I'm going to come at it from a different angle. A lot of my work has to deal with issues of health regarding mental health and disability, and certainly the fact that the Florida Farm Colony for the Epileptic and Feeble-Minded was established in 1921, right after the pandemic. So looking at whether there's a relationship between that or not, and there goes my phone. Sorry, I have a landline. I am an old man, so very interesting, this relationship. But I'd also like to look at other pandemics during this time, or epidemics during this time period, and think about that relationship. So in 1887, there was a huge epidemic in Jacksonville. Jacksonville at this point has a population of approximately 10 to 15,000. Almost 5,000 people come down with the flu, with yellow fever at this time. So that's unbelievable. 437 people die. And in response to this, in response to the city's rather amazing lack of ability to deal with this, the governor, Francis Fleming, who's just inaugurated that year, he loses his brother and his law partner to this yellow fever epidemic. The election results have to be held up for 10 days because people can't cross county lines to get through that. And Fleming, the first thing he does is this legislature at this point only goes into session once every 2 years, so they don't do much. But immediately he calls a special session of the legislature to ensure that they will deal with issues of health on a statewide level and develop directly out of the failure of the city of Jacksonville to deal with anything regarding the yellow fever epidemic. And I think that's pretty interesting, as is kind of the story of an earlier yellow fever epidemic in the town of St. Joseph, which today doesn't exist. Okay, Port St. Joe does, and St. Joseph is near that. So in 1838, Florida territorial delegates go to this town, which at this point had a population of about 4,000, which is significantly large in territorial Florida, to develop a constitution for the territory of Florida, assuming Florida will be a state sooner or later. Will be a state in 8 more years, right? So this town has an important place in Florida history. 2 years later, yellow fever epidemic brought by people on ships from the Caribbean destroys the town, and the town doesn't exist after 1840. So if you look on the map today for the town where the Florida Constitution, first Florida Constitution was developed, it's not there. So certainly these ideas about health and pandemics and epidemics are rife throughout Florida history, not just the great pandemic of 1918, which is really amazing, but other ones as well. And certainly I think the one, and Gary mentioned this, the one that we really at some point need to talk about in Florida is the great long-lasting Columbian Exchange pandemic. Alfred Crosby writes a book called The Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange pandemic is basically the destruction of indigenous people in Florida because of diseases of which they have no immunity. And so, that at some level is not seen in terms of health or pandemic. It's just seen, well, Europeans came and they brought this disease, they didn't know. Well, at some level, it's as draconian a pandemic certainly as this, and probably much more so, and needs to be looked at in those terms. So when we see, oh my gosh, this is horrible, this pandemic, yes, it is. The fact that all these people have died, the fact that all these people die in 1918, yes, terrible. But certainly, if we look at the pandemic brought about by European contact, by European encounter, that is to me the ultimate pandemic in American history in general and in Florida history in particular.
Thank you. Mr. Kashini?
Hello. Most of my work revolves around the history of infectious disease in 20th century US. And my thesis focused on the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, the flu pandemic in 1918 in the South. I study the historical epidemiology of the flu, so its morbidity and mortality distribution in different communities throughout the South, throughout Florida. And recently I've been interested in the American Empire and the flu pandemic in American colonies abroad, and of course shaping post-World War I international relations, US foreign policy, with how the US conducted global health policy in the years to come. I've recently become interested in spatial and geographic history of the flu, with the maps that I've been putting together with a friend of mine from Tennessee Technological University, where we map flu mortality in 1918 in Florida to understand the different mortality load between races, African American and white, in different counties throughout Florida in 1918. So that's where my work is currently at, and I'm hoping to put together a larger project on not just quantitatively addressing the historical epidemiology of the pandemic in Florida, but also having context and qualitative sources to understand the experience of suffering and responses to the pandemic.
So both Professor Knoll and Mr. Kashini brought up the issue of race. And so I would like for you to comment a little bit about the kinds of issues that came up in the pandemic that dealt with or affected, had different effects racially and different effects perhaps by class. So Professor Momino?
Certainly. That's one of the great parallels, but that's true of all plagues, I believe. The poor, immigrants, laborers are almost always affected. During World War I, now we have to remember, by the way, that the Spanish flu occurs during World War I. Now, let's take a broader lens here. If you look at the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and 1915, there really had not been a major world war. And there was a word to describe Western Europe, America, it was progress. Many of the great epidemics of the past had been wiped out. Streetcars, department stores, the quality of life was improving. And then you have this disaster of World War I on a colossal level. I think fought over five continents. And the suffering is just tremendous, on the battlefield. But in America, the number of lives lost, I believe it's around 400,000, more than died in World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam, is one way of looking at it in perspective. during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, for instance, in Ybor City, almost all the group most hardly hit was Cubans and Italians in West Tampa and Ybor City. Something like three of every four Latins in Ybor City suffered. African Americans suffered. One of the problems was we really didn't have a modern health system up at the time. Moreover, during pandemics, the natural tendency is to flee. So many doctors simply left, saving their lives. For instance, Steve mentioned the yellow fever epidemic, 1870s and 1880s. One of the great heroes there is this black doctor in Jacksonville, the first black physician, Alexander Darnes, heroically was treating yellow fever patients at this time. In Tampa, there was no hospital for African Americans in 1918. So that's one huge parallel between wars. I'm sure I'll think of other things later, but Steve, take it away.
Certainly, again, I'm going to focus on the yellow fever epidemic. And Gary is right. Most of those people who had the means and the financial resources to leave the city do. Of course, the problem is many places won't take them. So there's a great picture in Harper's Weekly of a train heading to Waycross, Georgia, and militiamen are standing there with weapons, and the voice bubble says, and the assumption is if you are from Jacksonville, you can't get off here. But wealthy people do flee the city, leaving the toll to be taken by the poor people, poor whites, and African Americans. And unbelievably true in this case. And particularly hard hit is the black neighborhood of La Villa, which just had been the year before annexed into the city of Jacksonville. It had been its own city, but it's annexed into Jacksonville to kind of to negate the political power of African Americans within that community. So if it's in the city of Jacksonville, they will not be able to elect black councilmen or elect a black mayor. So this combination of political instability tied in with the fact that poor and African American communities are bearing the brunt of this lead to, I'm sure, as Andrew has found, showing us statistically that the numbers within those communities are significantly higher percentage-wise than for white and particularly for wealthier individuals. And so it's basically the same story back then as today.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. The connection between the experience of disease, morbidity, the actual infection, and the death of it from it, mortality, is in the history of Florida always disproportionately put on the marginalized and oppressed, and usually those without access to the written word. So their stories are kind of lost in the historiography. And that's why we haven't covered it extensively, because according to most historians that come out of the turn towards the history of medicine in the second half of the 20th century, those stories don't exist. The yellow fever epidemics in Tampa and Jacksonville in 1887 and 1888, and on to the 1918 pandemic, and then forward. The four big diseases of poverty of the South are yellow fever, malaria, hookworm, and pellagra. And in most of those diseases, one would find heightened morbidity and mortality among African Americans and poor whites. Unique about malaria and yellow fever is that unlike influenza, which has environmental components in the sense that deforestation will move bird populations and they will mix with local domesticated bird populations, thus spawning a pandemic. If it's a novel type of virus, yellow fever and malaria are vector-borne diseases. And because they're connected to mosquitoes, they have unique ecological tethers. So influenza can reach wherever people go. The higher the density of a of an environment, the better it is for the flu virus. The better it is for any kind of virus. But yellow fever and malaria are unique in that, like dengue and other Zika, other mosquito-borne diseases, it depends on where you live that will dictate who first suffers from the illness. And so African Americans and poor whites live in swampy areas, rural areas, areas outside of the zones where the Department of Health has some control, where hospitals are accessible. And so they are left to fight disease alone. The historian Margaret Humphreys has written extensively on malaria and yellow fever and talks about how at one point in American history, it extended all the way to the tip of Canada. But with industrialization and with public health initiatives in the north, it pushes malaria and yellow fever down towards the south, where they don't see those kinds of initiatives for a wide range of reasons: corruption, poverty, and of course the Civil War. And so those that are left in that death grip of yellow fever and malaria are those who don't have access or denied access because of their skin color. And it's the same thing with 1918. The difference is that it's now no longer tethered to a swampy region outside of a big city, but now it's widespread across the state. Military mobilization is occurring, which is facilitating the spread into big cities with large bases. So Jacksonville has Camp Johnston. Pensacola is obviously a big military city. And so those cities will be struck first because of mobilization. My work seeks to understand not the first initial deaths of the virus in the 1918 flu, but where mortality was most intense, which appears to be for Black people in those rural areas where they would not have access to social services, to hospitals, just geographically. Even if they did live in cities, those basic services would be denied to them because of legalized segregation. So the history of disease is the history of race to some extent.
Thank
Connie,
you.
may I add a few thoughts?
Sure.
Regarding the last speaker, one of the fascinating consequences of the yellow fever epidemics is the Floridians' migration to the North Carolina mountains dates time. That they understand why, but they realized if they were in highlands or caches, they never contracted yellow fever. But a few other things. What was I think you can make an argument the most vulnerable work group in Florida during the influenza of 1918 was telegraph operators, almost exclusively women in tight rooms. In Jacksonville and Tampa, I think 3 of every 4 telegraph operators contracted influenza, many of them dying, most of them young single women. The most vulnerable group, not the most vulnerable group, but the group that took hit from influenza in 1918 was the Seminoles. They seemingly, this is before the Tamiami Trail. If any group was safe from Spanish flu, it was the Seminoles, but an aviator crashed his plane. He was flying from Arcadia, believe it or not, at an air base in World War I. It crashed in the Everglades. A rescue party went out to find the person, and one of the rescuers had influenza, and 10 Seminoles died. In the proportion, that's a tremendous hit. Another interesting point in World War I, one of the big arguments now is over leadership. Has President Trump failed us? In World War I, Woodrow Wilson never made a single remark about the influenza. He was concerned with winning the war. Ironically, he contracted Spanish influenza while he was in Paris at the peace talks, nearly died, probably contributed to his stroke at that time. And finally, relating to Steve's point about cities kind of embargoing other citizens. Yellow fever epidemic of 1880s. Bartow outlawed anyone from Tampa entering the city limits. And one of the Tampa newspapers reported, who Bartow anyway?
Let me, interesting stuff. Let me also build on what Andrew's saying. And certainly, you know, as you teach today, you know, it's the vaunted triptych of societal analysis, right? The three things of which class, race, and gender. And, you know, as I teach disability, I'm trying to assume and tell my students that there's a fourth category of analysis, and that's disability. And all four of those certainly play out with these epidemics and pandemics and show the disparities between them. As Gary just talked about, you know, women appear to be more involved in the Spanish flu in Tampa, and because of their occupation, they're located in these tight-fitting rooms. Certainly, class matters as well. You know, it's not just African Americans; it's poor whites as well who suffer tremendously. And certainly, people with disabilities really are those people who have the least possible ways of dealing with these diseases and these horrific pandemics. So all four of these analytical factors, I think, really play out and interplay with each other. So, you know, if you're a poor Black woman who happens to be disabled, you know, you are probably going to catch one of the yellow fever, the flu, the coronavirus. And if you catch it, you're going to get it worse. And, you know, if you get it worse, you're probably going to have either long-term consequences or you're going to die. So certainly that is important. And I think certainly Wilson says nothing, but when we look at the great epidemic of the 1980s, that's the AIDS epidemic. You know, Ronald Reagan says nothing about AIDS for almost his entire 8-year presidency, as you know, thousands of people, certainly not to the level of what's happening today, but thousands of people are infected and are dying. And, you know, for political reasons, Reagan refuses to say anything, ignores the disease, basically poo-poos it because, you know, it is assumed to be the gay plague, and therefore if he feels any kind of compassion for these people, he will alienate his base, who assume this is God's wrath upon people who dare to do something against the laws of the Bible. So, you know, at some level, Trump's non-action is part of a long American tradition of non-action. That doesn't excuse it, because supposedly we're better now than we were then. But certainly, you know, we can't go back and say, well, Trump didn't do anything, but Joe Jones did. Well, they didn't either.
Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. You know, the fact that race and class have a connection to the experience of disease and death resulting from it isn't connected to the fact that, in my research, African Americans are biologically or racially different than anybody else. Eugenicists and race scientists in the early 20th century tried to prove that on numerous occasions, and they themselves couldn't agree on the biological difference or the immunological difference that predisposed African Americans to disproportionate mortality versus whites and their ability to survive in some cases. It's less connected to the difference between race and much more connected to the politics that have, you know, been the bedrock of American history, and that is the politics of inequity and inequality. That, you know, we can't deny that systemic racism hasn't had a steep role in shaping the way American pandemics and epidemics are experienced. And it isn't just racism. It is, you know, the experience of the disabled, as Dr. Noel mentions. It's the experience of women, as Dr. Mormina mentions. People who are not only in the moment of a pandemic or an epidemic, not able to get the care that they need because of those inequities and inequalities, but also the void in their stories, the absence of them in archives, the difficulty of piecing their history together, and not that historians are the voice of some past oppressed people, but that historians have the responsibility to let them speak about their experiences in the past, you know, and telling us what the pandemic was like for them.
Connie, the one kind of epidemic that is different from this, but certainly leads to notions of fear and concern and fright, are the periodic epidemics of polio that roil the nation in the 1900s, up until the 1950s, the late 1950s, when the Salk and Sabin vaccines come. You know, this is a disease that is caused by, at some level, by progress, because at some point we are not able to get those immunities to this disease because our streets have been cleaned. We have become better at avoiding things like cholera and diphtheria and yellow fever by cleaning streets and everything else. And so people are not necessarily then immune to the virus that causes the polio disorder. And it is so fearful to Americans because we recognize that it's not going to be that poor family that has hookworm down the street that's going to get it. I can't get hookworm because I live in a nice house, right? I can't get this stuff. I can't get syphilis because, you know, I'm an upright, moral person. But, oh my God, you know, this is like you spin the dice, and polio can come in my door and get my upper class daughter, and she can be paralyzed tomorrow. And so that's why that is so fearful, because it plays against all those things that Andrew and Gary were talking about relating to race and class and gender. So, and Andrew's way too young to remember, but Connie, you and Gary and I, the amazing stuff when the vaccine was developed. And I can remember lining up on a Sunday in a public school to get that shot. You know, and I mean, it was like, you know, the world was a different place. And so, you know, so a very interesting relationship to what's going on today.
Steve, one of my favorite stories regarding that, Daniel Shore told the story in around 2000. A young NPR colleague to go with him to a banquet where he was receiving the Albert Salk Award. And the colleague said, well, who's Dr. Salk? And Shore explains, well, he developed a polio vaccine. And there's a long pause and the question, what's polio?
Yeah.
It was the campaign to eradicate polio was so successful, most students don't know what it is today.
It's, yeah. And certainly the relationship of that, I mean, you know, I know we're getting a little off topic, but the relationship of that to Roosevelt, I think, is truly,
Yes.
you know, here on the one hand, he has a connection to the American people during that horrific time of the Depression because they know he's suffered like them, even though he is a wealthy Brahmin from upstate New York, you know, living on a huge manor, but he has suffered, but on the other hand, he avoids any public recognition of his disability because that would be a sign of weakness. And so, you know, there's only one extant photograph of him in a wheelchair. And the debate over whether to put a statue of Roosevelt in a wheelchair at his memorial in DC was problematic and long lasting. It wasn't there at the beginning.
Yes.
And, you know, people with disabilities raised hell about that. Other people said, this is not what he wanted. This is not who he was. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition. And certainly, you know, when we see the press goes along with this. I mean, the people knew he was in a wheelchair. The people knew that he couldn't walk, but they went along with it because they thought it was best for the country, you know. And you, I mean, you couldn't imagine that happening now, pulling this over on the American people like that. But, you know, his relationship with polio, you know, is profoundly important, and, you know, I think really shapes his vision of America and his understanding of the New Deal. And, you know, when I talk about the New Deal in my classes in Roosevelt, I say, understand that this is a function of his disability, you know, that this is why. So I think it's important to bring that into the conversation.
Why don't we move to public history a little bit? And let me ask another question. The pandemic arrived as World War I was ending, and like the rest of the nation, Floridians welcomed the soldiers home, and they created monuments to their sacrifices. How did Floridians commemorate and honor the death of the victims of the pandemic?
By doing nothing.
Nothing?
There is a single monument to the victims of the Spanish flu. Seriously, I don't believe that. I don't know if there's a monument to yellow fever victims either.
Yes, there are. Yeah.
Back to that point, we're a can-do nation. These are episodes where our inability to act, our unwillingness to act, our embarrassment about so many deaths, we simply forget about it. I'm not sure it's Europe. Any nation has honored the Spanish flu victims. Not even the Spanish, who were not even part of the Spanish flu, but that's another session.
Yeah, there is a yellow fever monument in Gainesville, memorializing the two members of the Gainesville Guard, the militia group who go up to Jacksonville and Fernandina to help out and come back and die. And this monument is placed downtown on the square, right next to Old Joe, the Confederate monument. And in the 1920s, it is moved to Evergreen Cemetery, which is the public cemetery in Gainesville. It's a beautiful place and well kept, but the monument becomes overgrown and decrepit and everything else. And within the last 20 years, an Eagle Scout took it upon himself to you know, going back into history, and found out about this, saw that the monument was in bad shape, and he restored it. And so now it is in a prominent place in the cemetery, marking the graves of these people and memorializing what they did to help. And in Jacksonville, there is a monument to the people who died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1888. But it was only put up, I think, in 1998, which is really interesting.
Andrew?
There are no monuments or large monuments that are well known for the 1918 pandemic. Obviously, I wasn't so sure about yellow fever, but there are apparently, and I hadn't known that. But for the 1918 pandemic, there aren't any. But what I find more interesting is why there aren't any, and there are a few reasons for this. One is that historians just weren't interested in the pandemic, in its aftermath. You know, there's just older methods of conducting history and what historians were expected to write. Like Dr. Mormina mentioned, a can-do nation, or the myth of a can-do nation. And so can-do historians who write about the exploits between man and not man and microbe. And so that kind of suggests a specific kind of history. You know, and it neglects other themes that are current and relevant to the story, but are not worth pursuing. Maybe, you know, historians just expect it to be the realm of physicians, and it was. After the pandemic, the writings that were put out were by epidemiologists and statisticians and physicians, but not for the purposes of preserving a record or understanding why the pandemic happened or why it was allowed to do what it did, but more so because they wanted to understand it better in anticipation of its return. The idea was that the pandemic would come back and we need to be better prepared for it by mining all the data that we can to understand what had happened. So historians just weren't interested. They were interested in the war and the birth of an international system thereafter. But also trauma. People hadn't wanted to, who would want to read something about 675,000 Americans dying within weeks compared to what every war in the 20th century had done? And it's not that Americans had known that war was going to produce the casualties that it did in the remaining parts of the 20th century. People in history don't know the end of the story. And so they don't know, perhaps people had thought that war was going to get worse. They called the war to end all wars. So the expectation was that this is as bad as it can get. But a pandemic that does way more damage within weeks than what, entire months of combat did in Europe, that's something that people wouldn't want to read about. And so the trauma has something to do with it. I think the rapid emergence and disappearance of the virus, it suddenly emerges in 3 waves, the first in March 1918, and then it disappears and nobody pays attention to it until the second wave, which begins in September and reaches its peak in October, having killed between 50 to 100 million people worldwide, disappears and then comes back again in January 1919 with the same mild effect it began with in March, and then it disappeared. And so, I think the entrance and exit, whereas war is something that can be observed as a political and economic and diplomatic changes that are observable, but viruses, there's also the limits of scientific knowledge at this point. So the bacteriological paradigm is prevalent, and Richard Shope is the virologist who isolates influenza, the type A influenza virus, which is the kind that causes pandemics. There's several types, but B is the kind that we get, a mixture of A and B for seasonal. This is pandemic influenza, so it's different. This is one that people have no immunity to. You've heard herd immunity in the news. Herd immunity is kind of what you gain from seasonal flu. It's not meant to kill mass swaths of people. But type A influenza can, because we have no recognized immunity to it. And Shope is the guy who isolates it from swine, and he does this in 1933. So long after the 1918 pandemic. That's when influenza virology really takes flight. And so the idea is that this is a bacteria, and how do you, go about fighting bacteria? We'll use antibacterial medication, but this is a virus. It's different. And so the limits of scientific knowledge too have something to do with the way Floridians memorialize the flu. Not knowing what the end of the story would look like. But an even bigger aspect of this is the role of the US in the world at the time and the impact that the flu has on the US versus the rest of the world. The flu kills 675,000 Americans in several weeks in the US. But in places like India and China, it kills between 10 to 20 million within weeks. So the impact on the countries themselves has something to do with the histories that they provide, because the biggest history departments in the world in 1918 were in the developed West, where the flu was not as impactful as other countries, especially those that are colonized. These are the colonizing countries. So they have the infrastructure to deal with it better. Even though the infrastructure wasn't very good, it was much better than what was in sub-Saharan Africa or India or Central Asia in 1918. So because of this proportionate death that the rest of the world experienced compared to the US, American historians didn't think that it was that big of a deal until, of course, American historians begin learning new languages to get access to new archives, okay, and the historiographical frame of reference shifts, okay, and historians begin accessing other countries and their narratives and seeing that this pandemic was indeed, one of the worst, if not the worst, in modern history. So I think that has something to do with the way we memorialize the flu, because in 1918 we just did not think that it was that important.
Thank you.
And kind of tied into that is the question, what will we do to memorialize or to remember this pandemic?
Yes.
Are we going to have a monument to the fallen? Are we going to have, and certainly monuments have changed dramatically since those phallic monuments memorializing great men who've won great wars, starting with the Vietnam Memorial, which at some level memorializes not the war, not how we participated in it, but memorializes the fallen, right? Are we going to have a similar monument, not a memorial, but a monument to those people who have fallen as a victim of this disease, this pandemic, to remember that their lives matter too? And I'm not sure, once again, it may tell us something about what we are as a country, because at some point, it appears that their lives don't matter, right? I mean, numbers now just kind of roll, well, today it's 171,000, now it's 109, that is a statistic. That does not put a human face on all of those individuals who have died. And certainly, if we're going to have some remembrance of this, we have to remember that these are individual people who lived lives, who had families, who participated in American society, and they are not just simply a statistical number.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that goes along with something else that that we saw in much earlier pandemics, like the Black Death. Okay, the Black Death had the effect of undermining the church, undermining the nobility, changing the political structure in many kinds of ways. And so I'm wondering, were there changes, not that dramatic, of course, but were there changes in the institutional makeup of government, in social institutions that we can trace to the 1918 pandemic?
That's a really interesting question. Let me answer it a little differently. I mean, if you think about the consequences, in some ways, that's what you're asking. The end of World War I resulted in one of the great social cultural eras in American history, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. Mm-hmm. There was also the Dark 20s, the Klan, Prohibition, religious nationalism. But you can make an argument that the end of World War I for America, casualties were relatively light. You had this incredible boom from 1920 to 1929. This was most creative eras in American history in terms of literature, arts, technology. Now, how that is related to the war and the pandemic is a debatable point, but it certainly followed that era. And we spent relatively little time grieving, certainly.
Bill, on what Gary said, I think it has much less of an impact than we think it should have. You would think with all those deaths that it would be a remarkable sea change in American society, and it doesn't appear that that was the case at all. All those people died, okay, it's a hiccup, we're moving on, we're moving to the 20s. And I would argue that the other great kind of catastrophe in this time period, the 1927 flood in the Mississippi, has a much larger social impact upon American society than the pandemic does. I mean, it leads to significant social mobility. It leads to opportunities, assumptions about government intervention, much more, I think that's the unanswered question, and maybe something that Andrew can either work on now or as he gets further into it, why that something that was as devastating as it was didn't have the impact it should have. Certainly within a year after that's over, we have this incredibly sustained economic development, right? The economic boom. There is a sharp downturn in 1919, and 1919 is this unbelievable year of racial tension and labor unrest, which probably don't have much to do with, and again, something else that Andrew might want to examine. But the question is then, why doesn't it? And again, counterfactual history is always problematic, but it seems to me that it should, and it doesn't, or at least I don't think it does. So,
previous historians in the second half of the 20th century who wrote about the flu historians like Alfred Crosby, they wrote that there was not much change, that the pandemic in 1918 didn't undermine power, but it didn't really bolster it either or preserve the status quo. With the growth of an interdisciplinary history, we may see things differently by using different methods. So the pandemic certainly changed medicine in the sense that public health initiatives grew because governments were afraid of what would happen if there were continued reoccurrences of the pandemic. Bacteriology grew, and in some cases, there was a restoration of trust in public health in some circles. In other cases, people grew to despise public health. And this is not just happening in 1918, this is a common thing in American history, is this distrust in science and distrust in medicine and in public health. So in 1905, before the flu, the Supreme Court decided a case, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, where the United States Supreme Court decided that the individual liberty of a person, of a citizen in the country, was not absolute, that state power, state police power, could rule over individual liberty in the case that the government needed to protect public health from a pandemic. The case was decided to vaccinate smallpox, vaccinate people against smallpox, but it's become kind of the classic tug of war between individual liberty and public health. What do my rights mean in a pandemic? Should I be allowed to go out without a mask because I can choose what I want to do with my body? Or should I wear a mask because the government expects me to do my duty, my civic duty, to protect others and myself, and try to limit the range and intensity of the pandemic? So that was the conversation that was being had in America, and in the period all the way to 1918, and it continues forward. So intellectually and in the legal philosophy, yes, there's some conversation. Medically, there's some conversation. Internationally, the League of Nations creates the influenza program, but it's really spearheaded by the French. It's not, the Americans aren't playing the game. They are still in isolationist ideas. They don't want to be involved with, the international system anymore. And so they don't actively contribute to disease surveillance and pandemic preparedness worldwide up until the invention of the CDC in 1946, which is not founded to attack pandemics worldwide, but to try and limit the intensity of malaria in the South. And that is why it is founded in Atlanta, because they need a base of operations to move throughout the South and limit the impact of malaria on Southern populations. So it's weird to see how you would think a pandemic in modern history as lethal and as intense as 1918 pandemic would have been, or would have generated the impact that something like the plague in the 14th centuries generated. But it did, just in ways that sometimes the power shift isn't visible or as visible. So evolutionary psychology is asking this question, and researchers are positing parasite stress theory, the idea that there is some microbiological or ecological determinism in the sense that where a regime is located in the world, in correlation to the equator, dictates the ecological experience, dictates the pathogen load, and thus sculpts political behavior. So the question is, why are most dictatorships located along the equator? Well, because higher pathogen load in those areas will make people more nativist. They're more afraid of immigrants because immigrants are bringing in disease. That's a common thing. 1917 Immigration Act stops most immigration coming to the US, especially from Asian countries. This is 1 year before the 1918 pandemic. But then in the 20s, that legislation gets more intense and intense and intense, and the eugenics movement begins sterilizing its own people. So if anything, in my opinion, the flu would have made people back political power and police power more in trying to rid society of disease in ways that aren't always dignifying marginalized and oppressed people. Racism increases, as we talked about. So yeah.
See, I would argue that that's probably overstating the case rather dramatically. And I think that when we look at fear of the other, we're not worried about fear of those people bringing the flu. We're worried about fear of those people bringing down the American gene pool, bringing down the American intellectual. And certainly when we talk about the 1905 Supreme Court case, that case is cited rather dramatically in the 1927 Buck versus Bell case, in which sterilization is declared appropriate and acceptable because if it's okay to vaccinate someone to protect society, it certainly is okay to sterilize somebody to protect society. So we are looking at, and I think this is certainly one reason why, building on what Andrew has to say about distrust of science. The people in charge or pushing eugenics are not these yokels from the backwoods. They are the leaders of the scientific community, and science is being used to push an agenda, and the agenda is that we need to protect ourselves, not about the flu, but protect ourselves from these people who are going to reduce us intellectually and destroy us as a people. And how to protect ourselves from that? We're going to use science, okay? And science is better ways to sterilize people. So I'm certainly, maybe not the flu, but certainly the notions of science tie in dramatically, and maybe the flu ties into that. So, but that's a really important part, as Gary said, of that dark side of the 20s as well. And when we talk about immigration restriction, it's not just about keeping those people out for political reasons or economic reasons, it's for eugenic reasons. And it's not, you're not inferior because you're an inferior person, you're inferior because you're a member of an inferior race. And the assumption is, there's a Jewish race, there's an Italian race, and that race is going to come here and lower our intellectual standards. So, scary stuff. And tied in, fear is really problematic. So, which is why it's, Roosevelt's assumptions about fear tie in, I think, with the fact that, he faced the polio and won. And so I'm not afraid of that. So you don't have to be afraid of this. And certainly that perception of the 1930s.
Let me add one factor relating to this. I think what's so exciting about this period of World War I is that the pandemic, the war is being fought with 4 raging issues have aggravated Americans for 20 or 30 years. Immigration, but immigration restriction, and that's going to take place in 1921 and then in 1924. Women's suffrage had been raging for decades. Prohibition, relating to the Germans in World War I, and religious fundamentalism, and labor activism, all connected. And you think about the parallels to today. I think Brooks wrote an article that the pandemic is one of 4 other pandemics taking place right now. The debate on climate change, race relations in America, immigration still an issue, obviously, with aliens and the undesirables, and a cultural war going on in America, all during this pandemic, which all this makes history really fascinating. Anyway, Andrew, that's a great background. Is that the sacrifice of Isaac in the background, the picture? Do I win Jeopardy for 100?
Yeah, that is Caravaggio's Binding of Isaac.
Oh, okay. Well, it's close.
Okay, so you've entered into what was my last question, which was, we've talked about various ways and various lenses for historians to look at the 1918 pandemic, but let's think about then how we're going to look at the current pandemic. What lens will be most useful for understanding the pandemic, recognizing that our vision is somewhat limited at this point. But what do you see as the most important lens for looking at the pandemic now and maybe comparing it to the 1918?
Let me look at it in 2 ways. I think looking at a macro level, kind of the worldwide international implications of what globalism means. That, that the China virus, that the international implications of a global world, a global economy, and how that affects everything. So I think that's an important way to look at how this thing spread, how it can be stopped, the relationship of different countries, that borders and walls don't stop viruses, don't stop microbes, as Andrew said, and that, how can we stop this? How can we deal with it? So this international stuff, and also on a very micro level, getting the stories of individuals who have been affected, because I think at some level those stories are being lost as people are dying, and I think it's really important for us to, get their stories and understand the human toll that this has taken on Florida as a state, on the United States as a nation, on the world as a whole, that this is something that is about people, and people who have lost loved ones, people who have lost livelihoods, people who have lost everything. And if we don't tell their story, it will just be, oh, a pandemic took place in the second decade of the 21st century and people died, here's the number. And if we want to be historians that look at stories, which is what history is, we need to get the stories of those people.
To compare and look at future ways of addressing the history, I think it narrows down to 2 major comparisons. I mean, we can continue comparing, but at some point we must remember that each pandemic is its own unique event, because the pathogen that causes the pandemic is different. The experience of a virus or a disease, an illness, is different. And of course, depending on the political status quo, the responses to the pandemic will be different. But there are generalities, there are some. And between the 1918 flu and the COVID-19, I think there are 2 big ones that I'd like to mention. One is the virus as both oppressor and liberator. I think we see, in the world, obviously a slant towards nationalism and populism, right-wing populism, and white supremacy. In countries that in 1918 fared better than the rest of the developing world, the global south. It's not that the pandemic causes them to be more nativist or causes them to be more populist or more nationalist. It's that the pandemic or the virus can certainly facilitate philosophies that previously weren't there, and allow political agents, political actors, and regimes to do one of 2 things: to securitize the state or to maintain democracy. So we see in Hungary, as an example, Viktor Orban, who is the Prime Minister of Hungary, enacting sweeping national security laws on the back of the idea that this is for the health of the public. So to preserve public health, we are going to enact, we're going to restrict museums and things like that, and theaters and all, to try and limit the kind of cultural discourse that's happening. And at the same time, continue and persist in politics. You see the same thing in China and in Iran, regimes that want to try and bolster the power of the party over the state. Limiting protests is a good example. So China and Hong Kong and independence movements and people not having the current regime. And so in the social distancing measures, protests can't happen. So they deploy police to break up the protests and say that it's for their own good. It's the classic Nazi Schutzhaft. We're going to throw you into a political prison for your own protection because the people don't want to have your kind of conversation. And it just isn't true. So you see political actors trying to power grab on the back of the pandemic. At the same time, you see a rebuttal against that. Huge sweeping national security laws, surveillance laws, big muscle police power, strong arm politics. Many people don't want that. They see countries that are able to fight COVID-19, like New Zealand, and they want to take part in the democratic process. So they are protesting, and they're allowed, and journalists are going out, and journalists are dying, okay? Not just by the pandemic, but for political purposes. And so you're seeing a push back, a global upheaval towards a world that is safe for democracy, as we would have said in 1918. So there's a geopolitical and national security aspect there. The other side is, I think a good comparison would be the distribution of mortality, race-wise, which is most of my work. In 1918, in Florida, Black people in 76% of Florida counties had higher mortality rates than white people. It was that the historians who had addressed Floridian mortality did not address the proportion to race. They addressed raw mortality numbers in which white people died more because there was more of them to die. But when those death numbers are put over the population size corresponding to race, one would see that in most Florida counties in 1918, Black people fared worse. The CDC just put out a study, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, that analyzed mortality data in America for children, in which the children make up a very small majority of deaths, or I'm sorry, a very small minority of deaths. There's not, I think it's like 0.03% or something like that of COVID deaths in America are children, but almost all of them are Hispanic or Black. And so that is the consistency between epidemics and pandemics in America, and Florida is a part of that. We will have to address inequality and inequity more, not just as historians, but as voters, as scientists, as active agents in the democratic process, if we want to keep ourselves and our species safe. We'll have to address climate change and ecological consequences of that, deforestation, and the increasing threat of pandemics long after COVID. So those are two aspects that I think are worthy of mentioning.
Anyone want to make?
Well, the fact that we're waiting in Zoom probably tells you a great deal of the consequences. One of the problems, and I'm really worried in that I'd like to complete this book with the last chapter on the topic of today, the pandemic, but we don't know how it's going to end. That's the problem. Are we going to have a third wave, a fourth wave? Who has any idea? You just think about our profession that conferences may be dinosaurs now in the future. We're teaching online, probably not very well. I teach a class on food and history. I taught summer, and I think will we ever see a buffet line again? That's hardly significant, but almost every aspect of American society is being touched by this.
But Gary, that may be one good result, not having a buffet line.
It's the best point of the day.
Yes.
Okay, we've almost reached the end of our time, so I'm going to ask if you have something we didn't talk about that you would like to comment on as a kind of closing to this panel.
Well, I'd like to mention one thing. I think at this time when we're really negative about the way the world is, it's just really wonderful to see engaged, involved, excited, wonderfully bright young people taking an interest in this stuff and engaging in work like this. So I'd like to give a thumbs up to Andrew here and tell him this is wonderful. I'm so impressed with what you're doing. You'll almost make up for the fact that I diss UCF all the time in my classes. And the making up for the fact that your police cars have national champions written on them. So, to me, it's really gratifying to see that you're doing this. And I just encourage you to keep up the work. So it's great. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the panel as well.
Well, I have to say, when I first saw the panel makeup, I thought, wow, we have two of the of the pillars of Florida history here as an undergraduate. But I directed his honors in the major thesis. I knew he was capable of doing it, but I thought, wow, this can be really difficult. And I applaud his courage at being on the panel, actually.
A young blood hawk.
Thank you all for having me.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank the Historical Society for putting us on. This is very
Yes.
And to our audience, I hope that it opens new avenues of thought for you.
Yep. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a great panel. Thanks to Connie Lester, Gary Mormino, Stephen Knoll, and Andrew Kashuni for giving us a lot to think about. Make sure to join us again tomorrow for what is sure to be another stimulating panel called Civil Rights, Equality, and Racial Justice in the Age of Black Lives Matter. The panel will be moderated by Florida Historical Society immediate past president Tracy Moore, with panelists David Jackson from Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Paul Ortiz from the University of Florida in Gainesville, and Abel Bartley from Clemson University. Following that panel, we'll recognize the most outstanding work being done in Florida history with our annual Florida Historical Society Awards. Thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow.